Welcome everybody. This is the third and final section of the course. It's a short section, just these final 2 weeks, but it's fundamentally different from the first two sections that came before it. The first section, the largest section of the course, if you remember, was more about the nuts and bolts, the timeline of any presidential campaign, beginning with these announcement speeches that we're experiencing now with droves of Republican contenders and Hillary Clinton on the other side, all the way through the debates, through the conventions, to the general election, etc. The second portion of the course was taking the nuts and bolts of individual elections, significant historic individual elections in the modern era since 1960. And then this final brief section of the course takes a step back from the trees to sort of see the forest that campaigns are, that our elections are, and ask bigger, broader questions like, what is the ideal function of elections in American democracy? What is the real function of elections in American democracy? In a sense, are our elections making our democracy better, healthier, or in a sense, worse and disadvantaged? Today I've broken those questions down, these bigger, broader issues, into three basic questions. The first question is, do campaigns matter? The second question is, do campaigns engage voters? And the third question, which is the broader subject that I'm going to spend the most time on in this lecture, is, are we in a permanent state of political campaigns? So let's take the first question. And to take the first question, which is, do campaigns matter? Does anything that we're talking about, in a sense, in this course, from the specific strategies in a debate to how you really manipulate your audience through a stump speech, to any of the techniques and tactics and strategies we've talked about that. In other words, do those choices, do those gaffes, do those mistakes really swing elections? And there's a group of people who think no, who think that elections are swung by and large by external factors, we'll call them contextual factors, and what we'll call political factors. So let's take the first example. These are contextual factors. So for your reading for the remainder of the course, aside from the Oaks readings, what we have is the Reagan Victory book about 1980. And there's an argument to be made that even though Reagan was kind of an up-and-comer in the Republican Party, even though Reagan wasn't a member of the so-called Eastern establishment, even though Reagan was a conservative and conservatives to that point had never held the presidency, and even though Reagan was up against an incumbent and the winning rate for incumbents is pretty high, that election was always, because of contextual factors, world factors, global factors, that was always Carter's race to lose and Reagan's race to win. So if you're in Jimmy Carter's camp, you have rising gas prices, which are not his fault. You have the fact that Russia has invaded Afghanistan, which has sent both the global economy and global security into turmoil. That is not his fault. You have the decision to then withdraw from the Olympics, which are being held in Moscow, which he was sort of forced into doing. You have the fact that the Iran hostage crisis, which he didn't cause, and certainly didn't want to endanger too many American lives in saving roughly 400 people who had been captured in Tehran, that lingered, timing-wise, it lingered throughout the election, and so it was this constant cloud hanging over the campaign of Jimmy Carter that demonstrated to many people his fecklessness and his failure of imagination and his failure of American foreign policy leadership. But had that happened a year later, it would have been over Reagan, or had it happened 2 years before, it probably wouldn't have mattered as much in the general election in 1979 and 1980. And so there's a large sense in which there were just so many things that had gone wrong in the world, and had gone wrong domestically in terms of gas prices and food prices and home shortages, etc., that weren't directly attributable to the 3-4 years that Carter was president. And so Carter was really facing an uphill battle. In other words, you can say that contextual factors arguably determine the outcome of American elections far more so than the content of this course. It's an argument to debate amongst yourselves. You could also say, and this is what some political scientists say, for instance, there's a book written in 2012 that's making some headway now and getting a lot of secondary publications called The Party Decides, by two University of Maryland political scientists who argue essentially that both in the length of the campaign and the way that money accumulates amongst candidates, that of course our primaries and caucuses after the McGovern Commission in 72 are more democratic, that we have more of a say than the past smoky room deals before 1972 and 68. But in a sense, still, the party superstructure, the party elites, the way that big donors allocate money, and the length of the process means that real upstart candidates, candidates who have made enemies of party elites, candidates who have made enemies of the biggest donors in the party, are not those candidates who are typically going to win. In fact, they go through the history of the nominations and they see that just aren't that many enemies of party elites who have ultimately been nominated. And so, because there's this process by which, through 18 Republican debates, including YouTube debates, including Google Plus debates that we'll likely have in the next years, that it's just very difficult to make an enemy of the party structure and then continue to survive and continue to have the money to go through such a long campaign, which is one of the topics that we're going to talk about today. The next factor that I want to talk about, the next question that I want to talk about as kind of an overview of campaigns and citizenship is, do campaigns engage the American public? I think the answer to the question, if we phrase it differently, do midterm elections, the off-year elections that happen every 2 years in between presidential elections, do those engage the public? The answer is a resounding no. Very few demographic groups actually show up in big droves to vote in those elections. The participation rates sometimes dip into the high 20%, often they're in the mid 30%, and that's about it. So midterm elections, I could say numerically, it would be very hard to make the argument that amongst the voting age public, that midterm elections, even in terms of how many of us know who our own elected representatives are, is very slim. Now, do presidential elections, the big stage, the big show, does that engage the American public? And I think that the jury's really out on that. That's a very debatable question. The highest turnout in American political history for a presidential election was in the middle of the Civil War in 1864, and this was 81% of the vote. And lots of other democratic countries get that even without being in the midst of a civil war. Americans, however, in the modern era, have really quite been different, sort of a milquetoast set of numbers. The 60s were all about 60s in the sense that we were in 60% of the voting age public who is eligible to vote voted in 60, 64, and 68. And then that number drips into the mid to low 50s all the way through 80, 84, 88, 92, and then it even gets into the 40s, and 49% of voting age people even bothered to vote in the Dole-Clinton campaign of 1996. And then that number creeps back up just to 50% for the disputed election between Bush and Gore in 2000. And then even amidst the war on terror, after 9/11, the 2004 election really only creeps up to about 54%. Then the big one that everybody was excited about in the sense that there was this new blood in politics with the Hillary and Obama and this long-term shootout primary caucus campaign, that was only 58% and then 56% in the 2012 election. And so the analogy I would make is this, just for the sake of making an argument. If you invited 100 people to a party that you were having that was important to you and 56 of them out of 100 showed up and 44 were absent, how would you feel about the success of your party? Perhaps it's a simplistic analogy, but by the same token, we can also say that we have a very short sample size in modern era elections. In other words, it seems as if our elections, by some measure, seem to happen again and again. The same arguments keep getting made, the same types of policy positions and issues and controversies continue to pop up. Yet at the same time, if you take the fact that African Americans really only get to vote in presidential elections in a protected way after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that women only ever got to vote after 1920 in an amendment to the Constitution, then the full modern era, where everyone except felons and people who are here illegally are able to vote, is really only after 1964, perhaps even 68. And then if you take into account that much of the primaries and caucuses were dominated by backroom, smoky room deals before the McGovern Commission that changed the election cycle in 1972, then if you have all of the people participating all of the time, perhaps our sample size for what we really can expect of American elections is only since 1972, with the elections in the 19th century being a distant bygone era where only one demographic is white males, and then even before that, before 1828, only white property-owning males could vote in those elections. And so we have a very small sample size in terms of talking about this, and perhaps there's changes on the horizon. There is one argument, however, to be made that change is not on the horizon, and so I'd like to spend the rest of the lecture introducing this question to you and one answer to this question, which is, I think, a vital one, and lots of communication scholars and political scientists worry about. And that question is this: are we in a state of permanent campaigning? And what we mean by this is we can talk about permanent campaigns in terms of the style of the presidential campaign or the style of the campaign and seeking to woo through aggressive PR tactics American public support, and then also the substance of the presidential campaign, the substance of the campaign. So two different senses of the permanent campaign is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the lecture.